Welcome everyone to tonight's panel discussion, targeting how we teach racial issues in the classroom. My name is Dave Johnson. I'm the current president of the Michigan Council for Social Studies, and I'm also the Online Learning Committee Chair. I'm really excited for tonight's discussion. As many of you know, events from this past summer solicited one of our first organizational statements that the Michigan Council for Social Studies has put out in many, many years. And we, in conjunction with the Michigan Council for History Education, condemned the racist practices and policies that resulted in, and sadly continues to result in, the use of violence against members of our society, particularly members of the Black community. So we promise to use our collaborative voice to make some positive changes in education and our local communities, and tonight's panel discussion is just one step down this pathway. So tonight we're going to be speaking with three amazing people that I've gotten a chance to know over the last few months as we plan tonight's discussion, and I will introduce them in just a moment. But first, a couple of quick housekeeping things. Please make sure that your microphones are muted throughout this. We will hopefully have some time for some Q&A at the end, and you can always use the chat in the interim to get our attention. And in a few weeks, the Michigan Council for Social Studies will be launching a fall webinar series that's been in development for many, many months. From September 19th until the day before elections, we'll be looking at the politics of elections, the history of elections, the geopolitics of elections, local and state elections. It's going to be election palooza, and teachers of grades K through 12 will have an opportunity to learn from MCSS, the Michigan Geographic Alliance, the Michigan Council for Economic Education, and other partner organizations once a week, every Monday. And each webinar is worth one state continuing education clock hour and is free to MCSS members. If you're not an MCSS member, you can become one for $40, and then you'll be able to register for this series and any other professional learning events that we hold this year. You can just go to www.mcssmi.org and join. Registration for this series will open up midweek next week. And now with that out of the way, it's time to get down to business and the real reason we're all here tonight. So I'm going to do a quick round of introductions, and I'm going to start with our moderator. Our moderator, Sean McBrady, taught science and social studies at the secondary level in Ann Arbor Public Schools before joining the Consultant Services Department at the Macomb ISD in 2012. Macomb ISD provides support and professional learning services to schools and teachers in Macomb County. As the social studies consultant, Sean is committed to helping schools implement the Michigan Social Studies Standards and the C3 framework through high-quality, research-based instructional support to teachers. And now on to our panelists. Marshall Collins is a school health coordinator and social studies teacher consultant for Traverse Bay Area Intermediate School District. He is heavily involved with the anti-racism work in the Traverse City area. He was born in northern Michigan and traveled back and forth from Florida with his parents as migrant workers. Marshall taught in the classroom for 10 years at Northport Public Schools, and he is now entering his 10th year at TBA ISD and has been a support for social justice in the Traverse City area, working with law enforcement and schools. Anthony Lewis is the Director of Business and Community Affairs with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. His team investigates cases of unlawful discrimination and provides training in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. They also work with schools on policy development and programming that promotes and supports a safe and equitable learning environment. And Harry Weaver is currently the Diversity and Culture Consultant for Chippewa Valley Schools in Macomb County. In this role, he helps the district realize their goal of embracing and celebrating diversity in the community. He has experience as a facilitator of anti-bias diversity training, has been an educator, an education director, certified trainer, and facilitator for the Anti-Defamation League, and has worked with students and teachers across the state and nation. These fantastic voices are here tonight, and I'd like to welcome them all. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, Sean McBrady from Macomb Intermediate School District. Sean?
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it. I really appreciate everybody joining us this evening. I see some familiar faces and then some people that I don't know, and really glad that you guys are here, and maybe we can connect at MCSS virtual conference in the spring or some of the other great MCSS offerings. I want to draw attention to the chat just for a second. When everybody was putting in their one word for about teaching racism in their schools. I did notice that nobody wrote because it's in the standards. Yet we are going to talk about that just briefly as we get started here. I do want to draw attention, though, to the fact that so many people put things like challenging, difficult, complexity, tough, difficult. All those things are certainly true from my perspective, and is likely the reason why you joined us tonight, so that we can learn together. You're not necessarily going to get all the answers tonight. We'll work together, but in education, we know that teachers pose really complex questions, and then students talk about it, colleagues talk about it, principals and superintendents and professors and consultants. We all talk about it, and through that conversation, we learn. So without further ado, we'll get to some of these questions. I'm going to call on some of our different panelists to lead off on different questions, and hopefully everybody will get a chance to weigh in. And then maybe this is just the first of other conversations that we can have. So if we don't get to all the questions that people had written in or that we had prepared for tonight, maybe you'll join us for another conversation sometime this school year. So Dave, we're going to start with you, and then we can open it up to any of the other panelists. But before we get in too deep, why don't you talk to us a little bit about how exploring race and racism aligns with our teaching and learning standards for social studies particularly, but our standards here in Michigan?
Absolutely. I'm going to share my screen again. So I was one of many, many people who worked over the course of 5 years on rewriting Michigan's social studies standards. And I'm going to share with you a couple of examples and rationale from our high school U.S. history course. But examples just like these exist in multiple grade levels, all the way down into the elementary and then up through middle school. And then you've got this really robust unit on civil rights in the high school U.S. history course. So if you take a look at what's on the screen right now, we're looking at standard thread 8.3, which is civil rights in the post-World War II era. And now we're not, because I moved the wrong button. So with this particular content expectation, you can see we're asking teachers to have a conversation in their classroom about civil rights. And the civil rights movement. And, we've listed some fine bullet points here that include, talking about them after World War II and during the Cold War, responses to Supreme Court decisions, etc. But when you look at that, you notice that there isn't any content attached to it or any content associated with that. And the reason for that is, there's many reasons for that, but one of the primarily big ones were we as the writing team sat down and we added in all these colorful examples, and we had this beautiful civil rights movement content expectation. And then we took a step back and came back a couple of meetings later and realized that that content expectation with all of those specific people and all of those specific events and all of those specific protest movements and et cetera named in the standard essentially became a year-long high school civil rights course. And when you looked at the fact that there were 50 total content expectations in that high school U.S. history course, we realized that even though we didn't want to, we had to pull back on what was included in the standard. And so we sort of distilled the standard down to every teacher in Michigan should be having conversations about the civil rights movement and those bullet points. But what we can't mandate, because they've got all this other content that they have to teach, is the specific who, what, when, where, and why. So we've included with all of our standards, these examples may include but are not limited to. And that's where we took all of these rich things that were initially in that standard when we rewrote it and put them down here so that districts around the state would have the freedom to choose which ones they delve into more deeply and which ones are extension and enrichment activities. So it's not the best solution, but it's the solution that we were able to come up with over the course of 5 years to make sure that we are teaching the heart of civil rights in the United States and all the good, bad, and ugly that goes along with that. And then giving teachers a starting point on, if you're struggling to come up with some names or some events or some details or even pieces of legislation, here's your starting point, but you're not limited to these. There may be some great local heroes in your region, or there may have been some local events that took place in your region that you may want to weave into your instruction as well. So that's why it's really called examples may include but are not limited to. And while this isn't limited just to the civil rights era, you'll find this throughout all of the standards. We did make sure that our standards held echoes of and drew attention to the civil rights movements throughout history in whatever class it was relevant to do so in.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate that. And no one in the state of Michigan really answer questions about our social studies standards as well as Dave Johnson. So for those of you that don't know Dave, certainly make sure you get his email address and reach out to him if you've got questions about the standards. So our standards definitely have, you know, some ideas and issues regarding slavery and Reconstruction and civil rights and, you know, Jim Crow. But I think it's clear to most of us that we need to do more than that. We're not yet living in this, you know, post-racial era. You know, we elected Barack Obama, and yet racism is still with us. So it's clear we need to do more. Harry, I'm going to turn to you for this next question. If you can help us with, you know, where do teachers begin? You know, how do we start with these lessons and these conversations? You know, we know it's an uncomfortable conversation as evidenced by what people put in the chat. So really give us a starting point and some advice for teachers on just how uncomfortable, you know, should we make these conversations and how do we get started?
Well, first of all, good evening. I'm glad everyone is able to join us. For those of you that don't know me, I'm a straight shooter. I don't do a lot of beating around the bush, and I don't leave a lot of room for misinterpretation. So the way I would initially address this question is your discomfort in having the discussion is minuscule in comparison to the discussion or the discomfort that comes along with experiencing racism in every corner of your life on a daily basis. So you have to take yourself out of the equation. Are you working for the students or not? And if your answer is yes, you are working for your students, then that determines how uncomfortable you're willing to be. Whether it's discussions about race or anything else, there absolutely is a certain level of discomfort having discussions about things you're not familiar with. And there has to be some effort to make yourself familiar with those things. So again, I mean, we talk about the discomfort in these discussions and how uncomfortable should it be. At some point, we've got to get students used to having difficult conversations. At some point, they've got to understand that there is a way to have discussions and learn from and with people you don't agree with. But the point is that you have to be able to learn. And one of the questions that I often get is, well, when should we start having these conversations? And my counter question is, when do kids start experiencing racism? Kids in kindergarten experience racism in the ways that they are not represented in the curriculum. They experience racism in the ways that if they are in a particular school district, their school may be under-resourced based on where they live. They may live where they live based on redlining procedures. So they're experiencing racism from day one. So the answer to the question is you start as early as you can. As soon as you start teaching them to read, you teach them about people like Rosa Parks and people like Martin Luther King. And while those are generic, so to speak, civil rights figures, what they do is open a conversation. Children are naturally curious. So if you start reading about Rosa Parks to a kindergartner, I remember the first time I started reading to my son about Rosa Parks and her sitting in the back of the bus, and he began to ask questions about why this was happening, his response was, well, that's stupid. And I don't encourage him to use that term to describe many things, but racism is stupid. And he realized that as a kindergartner. So we've got to stop acting like kids can't grasp these concepts, not only grasp them, but make critical decisions on what they look like. Like I said, as a kindergartner, my son was able to observe, this doesn't make sense. And most kindergartners would say the same thing. And the longer we let it go without allowing them to make those determinations, the more thoughts that we allow to get into their heads about racism does make sense. So if they're not being introduced to the conversation or being allowed to have the conversation until they're in 5th or 6th grade, and they've already heard all of these narratives from one side or the other, then we've lost 7, 8, 9 years that we could have been saying, hey, these are the things that led up to this. These are the reasons that these things happen. And your kindergartner can determine that they're stupid. Your 3rd grader can determine, yeah, this is ridiculous, and there's no way that our society should be that way. So again, your discomfort has to kind of get folded up and put in your pocket once you decide that you are here for educating students. And again, when we talk about when to start, we start as soon as we start opening books, as soon as we have them in a classroom.
Thank you, Harry, for that. I appreciate those remarks. And I'm wondering, and Marshall, maybe we can bring you in next on this for anything to add, but I'm wondering, I, as a teacher, maybe can get over my discomfort because I know the importance, but how might we help students kind of accept that discomfort is going to be there in these conversations? Or any other thoughts, Marshall, to add?
Well, like Harry said, because I totally agree with everything he said. If you start those conversations young, then it won't be a difficult conversation to have anymore. They'll be open and willing to have those conversations, and they'll stand up. Like I say, they'll stand up for things that are right. When they see something wrong in society, they'll be able to stand up, have a conversation about it, and stand up for the next person that's with them. So I totally agree with what Mr. Weaver said, is that we have to start having those conversations at a young age. And I keep telling people, it's time to get uncomfortable. We've been comfortable way too long, and we've been set in our ways. And you know what? Being comfortable is not working for us right now. It's not working. So it's time to get uncomfortable and have those conversations.
Anthony, any thoughts on this one before we move on to our next question?
No, actually, I was going to add something, but no, we can move on. Marshall and Harry, I have nothing to add.
Well, and it takes us into our next question, though, and I'm going to start with Harry again, but then Tony will come to you next. Starting early sounds great, and teachers might be in, but we know that these are sensitive topics, and we know the discomfort will be there. Even if we as teachers accept that, it still might be seen as controversial in the school or in the community to have conversations about race and racism with young students or high school students. So let's just assume that there might be some backlash from parents or even within the school, or a lack of support from administration to come, that comes with these conversations. Your principal might rather you just avoid talking about Black Lives Matter and current movements and stick to the curriculum. So what can you tell teachers that might be dealing with that type of backlash or lack of support?
I would say connected to the curriculum. I mean, it's back to how Dave was talking about the first question, how are explorations of race aligned with the standards? We can absolutely talk about Black Lives Matter under these social studies standards in terms of civil rights movement post World War II. It's a perfect fit. So if parents and the community and God forbid an administrator has a problem with us teaching things that are aligned with the state of Michigan standards, then the question becomes, why are we withholding things when the state says that we can do these things? I, over the summer, had an opportunity to do a training with REMC, with RISA, that basically certified me to find ancillary materials to align with Michigan social studies standards. So materials that support curriculum. So of course, the first thing I did was look for materials that were about the civil rights movement, that were about, pre-colonial Black Africa and things of that nature, because they are completely absent in the curriculum. And it's not that they don't align, they just aren't there. And one of the most violent things to me in the American school system is that Black children do not see themselves in the curriculum. And I don't use the term violence as an exaggeration. It is absolutely violent to erase someone from the annals of history. If someone says something about you that's a lie, you can refute a lie. But if you just don't exist, if you're never addressed, there's not a conversation you can facilitate. So this is the position we're leaving these Black kids in when we say, oh, we can't have a conversation about Black Lives Matter. We can't have a conversation about, these other civil rights movements. So again, to that, I would say these things absolutely align with the standards. And if you have problems teaching things that align with the standards based on who we're educating about, then we've got to talk about a different kind of problem and whether you belong in the position that you're in. So now, the ball goes to their court because they'll have to justify why they're so staunchly against teaching something that has been aligned with Michigan standards.
Tony, let's go to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to jump in real quick because something Harry said. There's a couple things. One of the things you want to do is you have to do some self-reflection first, because it's going to take courage. Okay, because yes, there may be times when your administrators may not provide you with full support, but if you are operating within the guidelines of the standards, and I know that from that particular standpoint, there's a lot. Teachers are given a lot of leeway on what you want to on the subjects and how you deliver the material, and so it's going to take. So for one, it's going to take courage, because it always takes courage to get out of your comfort zone and to be uncomfortable with the conversation, and also I think that you need to look at how did you become comfortable with the material that you were delivering for your classroom in general. How did you become comfortable with that material? Because when you first became a teacher, when you first stepped into a classroom, when you get a new textbook, you aren't automatically comfortable with the material. There's going to be a certain period of time where you're going to study, where you're going to research, where you're going to ensure that when you walk in front of that classroom, you know the material. And this is the same situation. And I think the same concept here is the same thing that you want to, is the same concept and same thing that you want to do here. And also, and one last thing in terms of, I want to go back to the same thing that Harry said in terms of just being the early stages of education, because see, the thing about it is, if you have these discussions at the very early stages of elementary education, if you're having these discussions then they aren't uncomfortable discussions in middle school. They aren't uncomfortable discussions in high school, because you know why? Because they've had these discussions in elementary school. And I give a perfect example. I like to give an example. My children, now it's a little different in terms of me, because, who I work for, and I've been there over 20 years. So I started before my kids were born. But like I said, I think that, actually for my two older children, when I first started, one of the things we did was I took them, and everybody's going to do this, but this is what I'm saying in terms of students understanding. Took them one spring break. I took them on a civil rights tour. We went to Atlanta. And what I did was, we spent the week. We went to Montgomery. We drove to Selma. We drove to Birmingham, and we drove back to Atlanta for the week. And that's what we did for the week. And I took them on a civil rights tour. And see, and here's the thing: when they came back to school the following week, they did a lot of interaction with their own peers. With their own peers, with their own students, and talking about what they experienced, and talking about some of the things they did, and then even challenged. And then at a couple of points, my youngest daughter, she's just that way. She started challenging her. She started challenging her teacher, and it created issues. And it created issues, actually. Quite frankly, it created issues. And I think that because you know why? Because it made her teacher uncomfortable. That she had a level of knowledge about certain things, because she had actually experienced it. She had actually seen it. She'd actually been able to touch certain things. And I think that uncomfortable, and I think that one of the things, and I want to harken back to self-reflection, because as a teacher, there's also going to have to be a certain level of self-reflection, because how do you react when you are uncomfortable? How do you react when you are uncomfortable? Because I think that also plays a role in why you may not want to get out of your comfort zone, but we have to. Like I said, but we have to. And like I said, for me, early stages of education first is where you want to engage our young people, and also second, there isn't any more opportunities now than the better opportunity now than incorporating civil rights and social justice education into the curriculum and weaving it into the curriculum and weaving current events into the curriculum.
I would add additionally, just as not an aside, but just a quick point. White teachers have to understand that your discomfort is a privilege. Your discomfort comes from you never having to address these things or not having a need to address these things on a regular basis. The way that I move throughout my day, on any given day, I'm gonna have to talk to somebody about race in some context, one way or the other, and I've been doing it for 40 some odd years. So understand that your discomfort comes from a place of privilege in whatever way you like to view that. Obviously, we could have an entirely different full panel on discussions surrounding privilege.
Marshall, I want to let you get in on this question too, just to wrap it up about, have you seen backlash from parents or community when a school tries to dig into issues like this?
I'm going to say, of course, and I'm going to say it comes from the administration. When my son was called the N-word, and it happened kind of repeatedly at the school. I was up there, and the principal didn't want to have the conversation. It's not happening in the school. Well, how are we supposed to know if we don't hear it? How are we supposed to know if no one reports it? I'm like, yo, dude, I'm reporting it to you right now. I'm telling you, it's happening in your school, okay? And that's the whole thing, to put it aside. Well, if we don't hear it, then we don't know what's going on? If it's not reported, how do we know what's going on? And I'm like, be smart here, man. You know what's going on in your hallways. Address it within the school. And my final push was the kid on the playground decided to, instead of saying the Denver Nuggets, he said the Denver. And I went up to the schools and I said, listen, either you do something about it or I'm going to just have the news up here, because I know that's what you don't want, is the news. And it ended up, I had to put together a program for all of Traverse City West Middle School that talked about racism, that talks about how word hurts and everything else like that. But people are just afraid and uncomfortable to discuss it, but they don't think about the student in the class who's uncomfortable every time that comes up. They don't think about the student that's uncomfortable when you talk about slavery, the civil rights movement. If you look at the history books, it's mostly negative things that involve, African Americans. And then the second one that I'd address is that when they talk about addressing Black Lives Matters, I would say, well, do you want me to talk about Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists? Yes, please talk about that. Okay, that's the first stage of Black Lives Matters, am I right? Let's talk about the civil rights movement. Okay, isn't that Black Lives Matters too? I mean, those are the things that people have to, for me, it's common sense. And if you can't put it together, then you're part of the problem too. And that's actually what I told the administrator in that situation also. But from there, and this is just what some of the things that have happened here in Traverse City through our Black Lives Matter protests we had here. I told the whole community my story, the whole community. And through that, superintendents have reached out to me. Now they want to play ball. Now we had a diversity bias training that Michigan Department of Civil Rights did for our superintendents and leaders up here in the Traverse City area. But it's like you have to be put on blast, and other people, community members, have to call the school and say, hey, why aren't you doing this? Hey, why did this happen? And hold them accountable, because they're not listening. They're not listening to what we're saying. And that's the reason why there's a huge Black Lives Matters movement right now, is because people aren't listening.
And Marsha, I appreciate that you're talking about something specific, both a specific incident, but then some strategies that you started to employ that you had, exposing things, drawing attention to it, involving a greater community or even the media. Tony, I want to turn back to you as we continue to explore strategies. You've been all over the state as well. What are some strategies that teachers can use to approach racism, in schools from students, whether it's, you hear a student say the N-word, or a student in class or in the hallway tells a racist joke. How do teachers, deal with that and approach that in the moment?
Okay, well, actually, two things. Well, first, I want to acknowledge all of our participants that we have here today, because I do want to ensure that that I acknowledge that this is that what I said before about becoming comfortable and the same ways that you learn and how you became comfortable with the material. I do want to recognize that this is your way. This is one step. By participating in this and by participating in Dave and holding something like this is all part of that education process for yourselves also. So I don't want to let this moment pass also without acknowledging that you are here, and that is the reason why you are here, to become comfortable and to learn and understand some of the strategies, some of the things that we're talking about here today. So I applaud that. And I sincerely hope that you take some of these strategies and take these things into the classroom with you, because it's going to take courage. Because I know, sitting here on a Thursday night is one thing, but actually addressing it in a classroom and actually putting it into practice is another thing, and I recognize that. So now, in terms of strategies, one of the things is the first thing you want to do is address it. Okay, you don't want to act as though you didn't hear it. You don't want to you don't want to like I said, ignore it in any way. Okay, that's first, because I think that because you do a disservice, because when you ignore it, or when you act as though you didn't hear it, or when you freeze, because for some you may freeze because you say, oh look, I don't know what to do in this situation. So the first thing is address it, and it could be addressed in a multitude of ways. When it's a student, I'll use that analogy first. One is a student that uses the N-word, or that uses the N-word or a racial slur, any racial slur, okay? And also, or when it's that tells a joke tells an inappropriate joke. Well, understand something. An inappropriate joke is inappropriate, period. That's why it's called an inappropriate joke. So you have to address it, and you need to address it in the same way as if your own sensibility was harmed. And I think that's the way we look at it, because when a student makes an inappropriate comment, and the teacher, you've deemed it to be an inappropriate comment because it hurts your sensibilities, or it affects your sensibilities, well, then you address that. Well, then you have to use that same concept now is to address it. First, one of the things you want to do is address it. You address the student in front of the class by stating that's inappropriate, because you have to understand something. Because in the classroom, you're not just speaking to that student, you're speaking to every other student in that classroom. By addressing it, you're sending a message. You're speaking to that student, but you're sending a message to everybody else that this is not acceptable. Okay, so that's first, you need to address it, and address it head on, and address it head on. And that's not an easy thing. But first, you need to acknowledge immediately that this is unacceptable, that's wrong, and that is not acceptable in our school. Okay, that is not acceptable behavior, period, but it's definitely not acceptable behavior in our school. Okay, that's first, you want to address it. Second, then you speak to the student, you ask the student after class to speak with them after class. Because now that you've addressed it in front of everybody, you don't need to embarrass the student. You've addressed it in front of them. You've told them this is unacceptable. You've let everyone else in the class know that you heard them and you're acknowledging that it's unacceptable. Okay, so that's first thing, is address it. But second, take this as a learning opportunity. Because far too often, like I said, far too often we default to discipline. We default to, well, we need to have this discussion with our principal. We default to, we need to have this discussion with the school resource officer, or with first, have a discussion with your student after class, 5 minutes, after class. It could be something as simple as, why? How did that, it could be, or it could be, how did that make you feel to tell, how did that make you feel to say that? Why? Why did you say that? What would, it could be those questions because you know what, at any age, when you ask a young person or any person to self-reflect why, they have to think, they have to self-reflect. They have to self-reflect on why, because you've already addressed that as wrong. So now they have to self-reflect, and at any age, even if they aren't able to articulate it, they feel it. Because you have your elementary students that may not be able to articulate why what they've done is wrong or why what they're doing is right, but they know what they're doing is wrong and they know what they're doing is right because you as an authority figure has established this is wrong, okay? I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with Jane Elliott, but she has it's the blue-eyed, brown-eyed experiment. There's a scene in there where she's addressing one of the students and she's asking him, do you know you're right? Why do you know you're right? Why do you? And she's kind of badgering him. Because he's an elementary school student, he didn't, because he's a third grader, he couldn't articulate why he knew he was right, but he knew he was right. So it's the same concept. Next, once you follow up with your student after school, follow up with them the next day. See, don't just let it go. Start your classroom off that next day. You do some research that night. Start your class off that next day addressing that, but this time giving background as to why that joke or why that word was inappropriate. Yes, it only takes 5 minutes at the beginning of your classroom because now you've reinforced it, okay? And then guess what? Then you can move on. But what that also does, it gives you confidence because by researching, it would also give you confidence in addressing it, okay? And addressing it the next time it happens because understand something, these are young people. It's gonna happen again. I mean, these are young people. That's just what they do. They test us, they test you at every moment and every time. It may not be that student, it'll be another student, but it's gonna happen again. Okay, so that's just two things. So that's, like I said, that's just two strategies. Address it head on, okay? And then then after class, have a discussion. After class, have a discussion with that student where you have them self-reflect as to why is that an issue? Why did you say that? Why this is? And then address it at the very beginning of class the next day. Address it because you want to reinforce it and then move on.
Tony, you took the words out of my mouth because making things punitive is the exact way to get kids to keep doing it. That is not the way to get them to stop doing something. And I also, if I might, I want to bring this to something specific because there may be something unique in the way this is handled. We always, at some point, hear students in our schools using the word nigger, and somebody is going to use it, and you're going to ask that child why, and they're going to say, because that's what people say in my house, because that's what I hear at home. So now you have to have a response to that without saying to them, your parents are doing you a disservice by using that language at home. So now they can go home and tell their parents that the teacher said that you're stupid. Instead, that has to be used as an opportunity to set an expectation. You know what? That might be the kind of language you use in your house or with your family, but it's not appropriate here. We don't use it here. If you were at a job and you use that word on your job, you would get fired. Treat this like your job. So that way you've not approached it in a way where, again, you're telling this kid that their parents are negligent, but at the same time, you're letting them know that the expectation is that in this environment, we don't use that language. And obviously that's not the only word that is on a list of a number of inappropriate words for a school environment.
Marshall, what do you wish that let's say a teacher had heard your son be called a slur at school? What do you wish that teacher would have done? How do you want them to handle it for your kids?
Well, I would have just liked the teacher to come up to my son and said, I heard you had an incident today. How are you feeling? Because my incident was a bit different because the kid who actually did that to my son was a teacher's kid. And the teacher caught my kid in the hallway And instead of asking how he was doing, she got down in front of him and said, "My son would never say anything like that," and walked away. And my son was distraught. We had to have a friend pick him up because he was crying outside the school. The teacher who he had put his faith in had broke his heart and basically said it was his problem, not the students. And so when I went and had a discussion with the administration, he said, "Well, it wasn't brought to my attention." And I said, "I think you're wrong." I said, at least one of your staff members knew about it. And he was like, "Nope." And I said, "Yes, because that staff member approached my kid and said something to him. But I guess she didn't say anything to you." And so right then he was stunned. And not until the next day that someone asked my son how he was doing. And so, like I said, how I wish it would have happened is that I believe the staff knew about it. And I wish someone just would have checked up on my son, because for 7.5 hours of the day, I'm putting my son in your hands. And whenever I taught, I always wanted to make sure that, I do it even when I coach, that I treat kids like I would treat my own kid, because I'm their parent for that 7.5 hours. And if something happens to them, I'm responsible for it. And so at the end of the day, I want my kids to leave with a smile. I don't want my kids leaving hurt and upset at me and all that kind of stuff. So, I just wish someone would have checked on them and said, "Hey, are you okay?" Whether it happened or whether it didn't happen, it came through that something may be bothering this young man. Someone should have checked on him.
I think that's really powerful. And it goes back to what Tony and Harry were saying about how our first instinct can't be punitive and discipline, because even in doing that, we're ignoring, the child that, has been discriminated against or victimized or just is not feeling like they're being taken care of. So getting rid of that punitive approach and looking at it that way, I think is really important to focus on, how we can heal and help that child that's just been, assaulted essentially.
Yeah.
In their school.
And I just want to add on that too. I think the old days of pulling the kids together and say, "Can you tell this person why you're upset?" And you're putting that person on blast right there. I think those things have to go. I think when a kid says something like that, suspension with no education has to go, because they're just going to come back and do it again. And, I told the administrator that I said, this is my third time here. What kind of education have you done to stop this from happening? And the answer was 0. He hasn't done anything. So it's repetitive behavior, but the only thing they're doing is, suspending them and suspending them and suspending them. And they're not really learning anything other than how to get out of the school.
Well, and as much as students need that education as well, I think teachers need help here too. And as Marshall, I'm going to stick with you as we go to our next question here. It's you're probably not surprised, and Tony maybe can correct my numbers here, but I think it's something like 92% of teachers in Michigan are white, and so and I think a lot of that 92% is wanting some type of help and support to, in order to be better anti-racist teachers or to deal with racism in the schools. But it wasn't part of our teacher training. It's not often, part of the back to school PD when we're learning about, Schoology and all the different, tech tips to make remote learning work. It's something that gets missed. So, that's a challenge. So how can a teacher, besides coming tonight, how can a teacher build their own capacity to be better at this in their school and be kind of an anti-racist leader in their school?
For me, it was it was a little bit easier for me only because of the relationship that I had with Michigan Department of Civil Rights with Anthony and Melissa, that I was able to reach out to them to try to get the implicit bias training. But I think that's what all schools really need, you know, even as I took it, it still opened up some eyes for myself, you know, and we all have that implicit bias. We all have that. And a lot of adults, I'm gonna say adults, are afraid to say it. They're afraid to say that they have biases because they don't believe they do. So as far as, you know, being a leader in this, when you go back to your school, go to the administration and say, hey, you know, what can we do to talk about this more in our school? What can we do? And you have to not think about your community. You have to think about the kids you serve, because they're what's important. That's educators' job, right? Is to work with kids and you know, make them, you know, working, you know, I just say nice people in our world, you know. And so I would go back and say to my administrator, hey, you know, here are some ideas, some implicit bias trainings. Let's take a look at our curriculum. Can we change some of the books that we're reading in our English classes and some of the ways that we just approach education?
Tony, I want to go to you with this too. I mean, I know you've talked about implicit bias. I've heard you speak about it, and Marshall's mentioning some potential training. So, you know, we know that there are schools out there that have an entirely white staff and even all white students in some cases, and it may be those buildings that need this type of training more than anywhere else. You know, where can schools get this type of training? What do they do?
Well, actually, if you're looking for, like I said, the training that Marshall's speaking of, it's an excellent training. So you can, but like I said, you can contact me or you can contact our office. All the requests come through me anyway, and then I have to send them out to our respective folks who, you know, who handle it. But like I said, like I said, you can contact me, send me an email, or whatever, and then I will, and then we'll follow up with you to get it scheduled, to do a consultation with you first, and then get it scheduled. To go, like I said, and then get it scheduled from there. But one of the things that I want to, you know, also talk about in terms of, the thing about it is that we need to have a paradigm shift, and I think that, you know, and because we teach to the comfort level of the majority, okay, and that's what, because diversity days are not for, you know, or for the majority, so to speak. You know, to be comfortable with, you know, to be comfortable and tolerant with everyone else, so to speak. So we teach the majority, and we teach in a way, and we put forth our thoughts in a way that supports supremacy. Okay. And see, because and what I mean by that is, as I said before, we have Diversity Day where so-called everyone else, you know, shows that all the diversity we have in the school, but it's put forth as the other, you know. So that's one of the things. We need to have a paradigm shift, and we need to start, and we need to move away from, as Harry said earlier, this comfort level of teaching to the majority's comfort level. Because one of the things when I was an investigator, one of the things I also did was mediations. I'm also a certified mediator, and one of the things I always used to say is if everyone is sufficiently pissed off, I've done my job. You know, that was how I used to think about things. When I'm done and everyone is sufficiently pissed off, I've done my job, because that means everyone's uncomfortable. That means I have tweaked everyone in some way to think about something that is dear to them, you know, to think in a different way. And I think we need to do the same, and we need to do the same thing in terms of shifting our paradigm and how we teach. And yes, implicit bias training, yes, implicit bias is definitely, it's something, but that's just a start. To me, that's just one piece. You know, training is not the panacea that everyone wants to make it out to be. It's just the start. And in the same way that you research in order to be the best teacher in front of your students in the same way you research the material, in the same way that you highlight and you study everything and you can recite everything that's in your textbooks. In the same way that you don't even need to teach from the textbook because now you've mastered so well that you paraphrase and you can paraphrase certain things. That's the same energy. That's that same energy you need to bring to understanding and to shifting your paradigm so that now you are teaching to everyone in your class and not teaching to the comfort level of the majority of students in your class. And I know that's kind of, like I said, that shift in what I'm saying is because you have to do just as much studying, especially as a social studies teacher. And I would say that if you were math teachers, because I've seen some fantastic techniques on how some folks are weaving in social justice issues into math, into how they deliver their math curriculum. I've seen some fantastic lesson plans regarding that. But we have to make sure that we shift away from teaching to the majority. And I know that's a tough thing to do. Because especially, like you said, yes, you go into a classroom, because I can tell you now, because Sean, just like you said, you have some teachers where, hey, there are some, districts where, yes, your teachers are maybe 100% or 99% white. But it's not going to be that way for long. Understand what I'm saying? And even then, or because your students, because just understand something, I can tell you now, just throughout Michigan, and I've had the opportunity, like I said, to travel from lake to lake, and you name the lake, I've been close to. Okay, I'll just put it that way. And one of the things that are happening is Michigan is a very diverse. Michigan is and the population shifts, and and the different cultural shifts here in Michigan. It's just a matter of time. And so either you can shift your paradigm now so that your students now can operate in a global economy, in a global society, because we are a global society. So if you are not already teaching your students these types of things and understanding, if you yourself are not educating yourself, if you yourself are not studying, and how do I do it? Because part of your job is not to simply regurgitate information so that your students regurgitate that information back to you. Okay, part of your job is preparing your students, is preparing them to move on to the next grade, preparing them to move on to the next subject, preparing them for bigger and larger and better things, and opening their minds, especially as a social studies teacher, for opening their minds and having them think in that thought process. So like I said, so that's the same concept. You need to educate yourself, because training will start to tweak your mind. It'll start to have you think, especially implicit bias training. There's certain techniques, and it'll have you start to think, hey, what am I gonna, hey, this is interesting to think about that. And yes, it'll start to have you maybe have to shift how you think about certain things. But are you truly preparing yourself to prepare your students for this global society that they are walking out into? Because understand something, they're gonna walk out to, because in a lot of these communities right now, what's happening is these young people are going to college, and they're going to college outside their communities. Okay, so even if they go to MSU, or even if they go to Saginaw Valley or wherever they, guess what? They're going outside their communities, and a lot of them are not coming back because they're realizing, hold it, I don't want to come back to this community. Some of them are not even coming back to their old high schools, because you know what? They know what they're walking back into. They know what those teachers, they know what they're going to see. They know. So like I said, so you have to understand, I think that it's not just teaching, but it's also preparing our students for this global society. So that's, like I said, so the training, yes, you can come to us for the training, we'll gladly do it. But I actually like working closely and working more with developing long-term plans on how we can move your student and move your staff through this continuum, and through this continuum, so that you are not only preparing, because just because you're all white doesn't mean you're going to live, that's where you're going to live, or that's where you're going to end up, because that society is dwindling.
Harry, you're busy preparing in a large school district in Macomb County to go back to school here, and you're working with all sorts of staff. What do you have planned? Well, first of all, I want to commend Chippewa Valley Schools for even having this position that's been created and invited you in. I think it's great, and I wish we had a Harry Weaver in every district in Macomb County here. But what is it that you're planning to do with staff and teachers this year?
So Anthony made a really good point with his last statement, talking about training. In a corporate setting, when you do training, the expectation is that the things you learn in the training will be implemented. And in some way that gets lost when we talk about anti-bias training and we talk about, cultural competency or whatever the buzzword happens to be in a particular moment. And I'm all about strategy. So one of the things I said when I interviewed to get this job, I said, I'm not about engagements, I'm about relationships. A one time a year diversity training is not going to help anyone accomplish anything. However, constant engagement of staff, from administration to support staff of every sort, is how you change a culture. And that is my plan. So everybody from every role, from lunch monitors to superintendents and everybody in between, will be getting the same message. We'll get the cultural competency. We'll get the implicit bias piece and all of these things. And again, there'll be ongoing conversations. And that's how you set an expectation. Again, once a year, engagement doesn't do anything for anybody. As a matter of fact, it's a disservice. I was just having a conversation with a colleague today and saying that the things that you make time for gauge what you find important. So we're not setting aside time to really delve into these things because we don't see them as important. In a larger context and in a different conversation, we can talk about how these conversations need to be happening in teacher preparation programs at these universities, because coming to a school district that somehow had the foresight to say, hey, we need somebody that does this on a full-time basis is a luxury. And it should not be the first time these teachers are hearing these conversations. These conversations should be happening in college classrooms, in teachers' colleges, saying, hey, okay, we're going to do this, this unit or this particular module on cultural competency and anti-bias. And again, all of these buzzwords that at some point meet at a confluence and end up meaning the same thing. But there's got to be a larger context or a greater effort for teachers to begin to get this and get the idea that it is important enough to actually spend some time in your college preparation courses to actually learn about it. And right now, that's just not happening.
And Harry, you're just one guy in a big district, and some districts don't have a Harry Weaver. So what type of things do you need in place? Do you have like a team of people from district wide that you kind of work with, or what's
I don't. You know what I have? I have a unique set of skills. So I have been facilitating anti-bias work since before it had a name, for 20 years now. And so I use that to my advantage. I've handled large crowds, small crowds, and touched all sorts of areas, from education to private businesses, so on and so forth. So because of that, I have the ability to actually deliver the training myself, deliver the workshops myself. That way I can make sure there's a consistent message going out. People can, all of the questions that people have can come to one source. The answers will be consistent. So I am one guy in a large district, which means I have a bunch of PD dates. I got a line of PD dates set up that are going to make sure that every staff member in the district has gotten to get some work and will on a regular basis get some work. So I'll be doing some district-wide stuff. I'll be doing some stuff. I'll be visiting school staff meetings and doing smaller engagements, but I'll be a regular presence at all sorts of gatherings of people.
So our districts that don't have you, what should they do? Any advice? And this, Marshall, Harry, Anthony can really answer this. Our districts that don't have somebody dedicated to do this work, where do you think they start?
Find somebody. Because what's going to happen is you're going to burn out your teachers, because the first step is always, well, hey, let's find a teacher in a district that's already into this kind of stuff. And we can use that person to also be a social justice person. And my wife is going through a little bit of that right now, but that teacher already has all of their million teacher duties to attend to. So you're going to burn that teacher out, or you're going to farm it out to somebody who this is not their area of expertise.
So teachers need to kind of advocate through their central office and their school board that this position is
Yeah,
important. We want to set aside money to have to pay someone to be
absolutely,
here.
absolutely.
And
Because when it comes down to it, and I think that any of us who's been involved in this to any degree, doing training sessions is not cheap. It's not inexpensive. So by the time you've done 7, 8, 10 training sessions, you could have paid somebody's salary, even if it is somebody who's half-time or three-quarter time, but their sole responsibility is taking care of equity matters in your district. So you're going to spend the money one way or the other. So the best way to do it is get that one individual who can concentrate on your district, can become familiar with the culture of your district, and do things accordingly, as opposed to bringing in, 8 different consultants on 8 different occasions who nobody has a relationship with anyone in your district other than this transactional relationship of, hey, I'm providing this service and you cutting the check.
Yeah, and I totally agree with what Harry just said. It goes from right now we're just talking about it, and like Harry said, that one-time thing doesn't work. You have to now move into some kind of action. You just can't have your 1 hour a year on opening day, saying this is what we're going to do with no true follow-up with it. You have to apply some action to it. And, even me here, this, being the advocate I am, that's just what I fell into, because like Mr. Weaver said, if somebody asks me about something, I'm going to tell them how I feel. I say, you asked me, so I'm going to tell you, and so I have, just been asked by a lot of people in our area, hey, can you speak on this? Hey, can you come talk to the group about this? Hey, can you do this? And, it's been me going everywhere, and it's not really my job, but it's what I do because it's something that needs to be done.
so it sounds like teachers need to kind of start, if they don't have someone in that position, start with themselves, look at their own curriculum, look at their own practices. And then if they know some other teachers that are interested in this work, they can start to look at broader policies and programs in their district and in their school from that bias perspective, and start the work, I suppose, from the inside out, if they can't hire a Harry Weaver or a Marshall Collins or anyone. So I was asking Harry, Marshall, I'm going to come back to you. I was asking Harry about kind of how he's starting the year and the trainings he's got going on. And as we know, many of our teachers are going back to remote teaching. However, we're not going to have kids in classrooms. And so that adds kind of an extra challenge on top of a pandemic. We've got, remote or virtual learning. And I know even just on this Zoom, it's a good example. I see a lot of names on the screen here of people that are listening in, but I don't know their reactions. I can't tell their facial expressions, and when people are wearing masks, I can't tell if they're smiling or crying sometimes. And so that presents a challenge for this type of work, where relationships and trust and reading, your listeners and listening and showing some of your listening are really important. So I'm gonna start with Marshall, and then Harry and Tony, hopefully you can get in too, but what recommendations do you have for teachers that are going back remote, but that want to address, these issues? They want to be an anti-racist teacher and address, race this fall.
Because I'm a teacher myself, I'm not in the classroom anymore, and, teachers that's doing this remote thing, all praises to you, and however you can be creative, do a little bit of research. Like, I go from site to site, and I was telling Tony, I was looking at this a Quizlet that just came through my email, and it says it's a time for change. So they have all these different little Quizlets and note cards and everything that you can use to in your class. That, what I'm trying to say is the stuff is there if you want it. The stuff is there for you to use in your classroom. You just sometimes have to do a little bit of research yourself. And also there's, I put the Quizlet link in there. There's also another site that I used when I was teaching in Northport. It was called Teaching Tolerance. That's a great resource that you can use also. I'm just throwing the links in there also for you. And then for me, one of the most important things as you go back to this online virtual teaching is to get to know your classes, get to know the group, the audience that you are teaching. You know, become familiar with them, know a little bit of their background. I was in a meeting the other day, and we had to do a quiz, not a Quizlet, but a Mentimeter, and it said, describe 5 things about yourself. And the first thing I wanted to do was write, African American. And, I couldn't do it, so I put down some other things, and I was like, I want everyone to know that I'm African American. And I couldn't put it in. It was either too long or, it was 2 words. And, I came back to it, and it was a bias thing too that I said in also. And I told the guy, I said, listen, this is the problem that happens in a lot of classes, okay? I wanted to explain. I wanted everyone to know that I was African American. And because I couldn't do that, I couldn't display that to everyone, I was like distraught. I was distraught and I was disengaged. And then every other person that did the Mentimeter and that turned into a Wordle, you know what the biggest word on there was? White. You know what the second word was? Female. 2 things that I am not. And I immediately became disengaged from what was going on to the point where I had to say, Marshall, you're 44 years old. Get back into it. Get back into it. But that's our students. If you don't know them, if you don't know their background, if you don't know what they're about, they'll become disengaged from it if it's really not about them too. So you got to know your whole group. And this is one thing that I do want to tell teachers is that you do not have to see their faces. Don't ask them to turn their cameras on because you don't know what their family life is like. There may be something in the back that they don't want you to see. They may be huddled up in a corner somewhere. They may have dirty dishes and clothes and everything in back of them. That's embarrassing for them to open up and for everyone to see. So, just I know this isn't quite answering the question, but when it comes to the virtual stuff, I believe there are things that you have to take in account first to engage your students rather than have them totally disengaged from you right away. And then some of the things that you can do, one of the things that I did like was showing, like, you can show clips from Eyes on the Prize, and then have discussions on that. You can show clips from Roots, have discussions on that. You can change some of the books you're reading. Instead of Romeo and Juliet, how about Read the Hate You Give? Change it up. Me going to school, high school, I was the only Black kid in my class my junior and senior year. We're reading books, it comes to the N-word, everyone turns and looks at me. Well, Marshall, what do you think? If I could go back and answer that, I would probably tell the teacher, you should probably get a different book. So we have to be conscious about the kind of activities and lessons that we do in our classes.
Hey, Marshall, you bring up a really good point there. And I think that there's a lot of, white teachers that, may not do the right thing, and don't do the right thing or say the right thing. And I know that, a lot of teachers back to school, even if they're going remote or virtual, are going to try to do things to get to know their students. But many times we ask questions like, what's your favorite movie? What's your favorite book? Kind of some surface level interest things. What do my students like? Do you guys have any recommendations, Harry or Tony, for, what can a teacher do? What can they ask what are some ways that they can get to know students on a little bit deeper level, to really know what those students, value and need from a teacher, as opposed to just, kind of those get to know you back to school questionnaires?
So really quick, I wanted to piggyback on something Mr. Collins said with regard to virtual teaching and not forcing kids to have their cameras on. Inviting someone into your home is a very intimate thing. There are people I've known for years that have never been to my house. And now all of a sudden, these families are expected to allow these teachers into their homes. Teachers that oftentimes they've already got a bit of a complex about because of maybe their prior school experience, or maybe just experiences they have in general with the education system. And we got to keep that in mind. Usually we have them, for lack of a better term, on our turf. And it makes it, it kind of gives us an advantage, so to speak, as educators. But we don't have that luxury right now. And I think we should be super conscious of that. Mm-hmm. With regard to your question, though, I really do think that a very honest question for kids is, what do you like to do? And not narrowing it down to a book or a movie, because some kids don't give a damn about a book. There are kids, or don't have any books, or don't have a favorite movie, or don't have a device with which to watch a movie. So simplifying a simple, what do you like to do? Yep. And if a kid says, I like to walk around the block, 10 times a day, maybe they've developed a like for doing that because they don't have these other amenities. They don't have video games. They don't have, these other things. So they've learned to enjoy something that doesn't cost them anything but time. So I think if we can ask these questions without putting them in particular boxes and explaining to them, what, this exercise is not a trick. I'm really trying to get to know you all as people, because oftentimes, and I talk about this every time I get an opportunity, we treat kids like they're aliens, when in fact, they're just smaller versions of us. So they expect and want the same things we want. Just as I expect, or if someone is truly interested in who I am, I expect them to listen when they ask me a question. Same thing with the student, same thing with kids. When you ask them, hey, what do you like to do? And if you roll your eyes when they say video games because you think it's a waste of time, well, then now they've got this impression of you that you're disregarding what their interests are. So again, if we can ask these questions earnestly and ask them in the same way and respect their responses the same way we would a colleague, then I think we can make some headway.
Thank you, Harry, for that. I do want to throw it to Dave and see if before I have you guys wrap up, and I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to kind of say one final thing before we leave our group here. But we've got about 15 minutes left. Dave, are there any questions that have already been put in the chat, or that you've collected, or that you want to gather right now?
We definitely have some time to throw a couple of questions into the chat. The chat has been exploding both with regular and private messages, so I have not seen other ones come directly in, but
let's do this. If we can just ask everybody, and I want to say I appreciate those of you that are kind of putting in some links and resources and suggestions. Maybe after we're done here, we can leave the Zoom open for just a couple minutes so people can copy and paste the chat into their own Word document or something, so they have access to that after we close down. In fact, I'd recommend doing it, right now, so that you don't lose out on it. But I'll go back to the panel for a second, Dave. If we just want to say, anybody that has a specific question for Marshall, Harry, or Tony here as we're getting ready to wrap up, you can go ahead and put it in the chat. If we have an opportunity to get to it, we can do that. I know Dave already put Tony's contact information in the chat when we were talking about the potential for them to reach out to him for that implicit bias training or other things from his organization. But while people are thinking about what they might want to do in the chat, Marshall, Harry, and Tony, why don't we start with you, because it's been a while since we heard from you. In 30 seconds or less than a minute, we started this Zoom by having everybody say in one word kind of how they felt about, teaching about racism in school. I'll give you more than one word, but in brief, 30 seconds or a minute, what's one last thing that you want to say tonight to kind of bring us full circle and to leave these teachers with?
Well, well, actually, there's a couple of things. One, I implore all of you to step out of your comfort zone because I know when you harken back to that day when you first came out of school and you stepped into a classroom for the first time, I'm sure there were nerves. I'm sure there was discomfort. I'm sure you were uncomfortable because this is the first time you've ever been in a class and you don't know what to expect. Well, your students feel that every day. And their students of color feel that times 10 every day. Because you know why? Because they've been in your classroom and don't know what to expect the next day. And unfortunately, some of them have been in your classroom and do know what to expect the next day, if you all know what I'm saying. So I implore you to please step out of your comfort zone, and also to subscribe to lifelong learning. And what I mean by that is as you continue, because there is no right wrong way to address so-called bigotry or address racism in your classroom. There isn't a right. There isn't. The only wrong way is to not do anything. Okay? Because mistakes are going to be made. Just like with your students, and I know I'm taking more than 30 seconds, but excuse me. But just like your students, okay? Just like when you come in there, your students don't know, you have to bring them along. You have to teach them the material. You teach them the material and you deliver the material. And guess what? Throughout the semester, they learn. They become more comfortable with the material. And you know what? As a teacher, guess what? You allow them, they're going to make mistakes. We grade papers so that way we keep score. Okay? And from that, you learn. You don't say, okay, you know what? You got this wrong, you failed. No, you got this wrong. Here's an opportunity to reinforce that. This is what you got wrong. This is where this is where you're strong at. This is where you have some challenges. That same concept applies to you in this situation because you're going to make mistakes. But as I said, the biggest mistake you can make is to not do anything. It's to not address it. It's to not educate yourself. Things like this. But see, as I said, this is not the panacea. These discussions are great, and I wish we had more interaction. Wish we had more interaction from you, because I would like to know what you're thinking and how you're feeling. Because you know what, you need that outlet also. You need that outlet amongst yourselves also to be able to talk through certain things. To be able to talk through that. But what I would like to see, is to get out of your comfort zone and to continue. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to make a mistake when you're trying to do the right thing. And that's the only thing. Don't be afraid to make a mistake when you're trying to do the right thing, because your students make mistakes every day and you don't throw them out with the bathwater. So, and I know as adults, sometimes it's very difficult to make a mistake because you may be, like you said, you may be looking at your support system that in place and your administrators and everything may not have that support system. But there's never, I'm doing this is another cliche, there's never a wrong time to do the right thing. And the right thing normally takes courage. Normally it takes courage. As I said before, I always like to give this analogy, to close out. Everybody likes breakfast. We have certain people like breakfast, but you know what a breakfast staple is? Bacon and eggs. And when it comes to bacon and eggs, guess what? The chicken is involved. Chicken lays an egg, keeps moving. The pig is committed. Which one are you?
All right, Tony, your 30 seconds is up. No, I appreciate your comments, Tony. Harry, why don't we go to you next? Any kind of closing thoughts?
Yes. So I want to say to the panelists, or about the panelists, we're here because we're good at what we do. But we didn't get good at what we do by just sitting around and being complacent at whatever space we might be in. Same thing with teachers. If you want to become proficient in anti-racism work, in anti-bias work, you have to continue to develop yourself. It's not something that's going to be served on a platter for you. There's a white fragility and how to be an anti-racist have kind of been hailed as the go-to textbooks, and they're great pieces, but it can't stop there. As a matter of fact, for anyone here who is looking for another book to read, I would suggest Kendi's first book, Stamped from the Beginning. And if you read that, it will absolutely disgust you, and it will push your desire to get into anti-racism work even more than his second book that's being so highly touted. Stamped from the Beginning, A History of Racism in America. It is, again, it'll fuel your, if it doesn't fuel your fire, you don't have a fire. But again, I say all of that to say, you got to continue to develop yourself. It's a journey. I'm not done. Anthony's not done. Mr. Collins is not done. Sean's not done. None of us are done. We're all on a journey, and we're all on it together, and we're all at different points. So the goal is to keep moving forward.
Marshall.
Yes. Continue to have those uncomfortable conversations, and not just within your classroom. I know, when I was teaching, the one thing I would say is, I know the one thing that I can control is what goes on in my classroom. And so I would kind of shut that door and be like, this is my classroom. We got to open that door, and we got to expand those uncomfortable conversations outside of our classroom to our administration and to our communities. So keep having those tough conversations, and find out who your who your fighters are in the community and in your school, because what I'm learning is that you can't do this alone. I have a group of people who help support me in my efforts, but I've actually told them in our small community that we're in is that we can't do this alone. We have to have, we need some of our white community members to stand up, and I didn't even say stand beside us. I said stand in front of us, so we're not doing all this work ourselves again. And so just continue, like I said, having those conversations outside of your classroom with your administration, with your community members, and find out who those star players are that you need.
Thank you all. Dave, did we have any questions pop up in the chat that, we just have a couple of minutes, I know, and I really would encourage our attendees that do have, questions that we obviously won't be able to get to in depth to, I appreciate these questions. Submit these questions to Dave. I'm sure we'd love to have a follow-up conversation, down the road, where maybe we can even get more specifically into, teaching, social studies with an anti-racist lens, or how to start, how do you conduct a book study around racism in your school? Harry mentioned a couple of great books. Can a teacher just, bring 30 copies to a staff meeting and tell, everybody to read this? And not everybody, maybe kind of has the authority or the skills to do that. So maybe we need to, collect some of this information from those of you that are in attendance, and figure out what we can do in our next webinar with this group or other groups as we go through the year.
So we did get a couple of questions in the chat, and I'm not entirely certain we can get to all of the ones that did come through, but one that I don't think we have really targeted tonight is just shifting the conversation a little bit. Meredith asked, as a college student and future teacher, what are some ways I can encourage my fellow students and professors to talk about these topics? And the answer may be the same way we've been talking about tonight, but there could be something more in depth. So I'm going to mute and see what Harry and Marshall and Anthony have on that.
I would say use your leverage. I mean, as a student, you're in a position where you're paying for that professor to talk to you. So when those subjects come up in class, when you're talking about pedagogies and whatever technical approaches that you're talking about in your education classes, bring up, well, hey, how do we approach this when we're talking about minoritized students, or when we're talking about poor students, or when we're talking about minoritized poor students? You know what I mean? So how do we adjust this for marginalized populations that this clearly does not fit? And so now that professor is going to have an answer, or he or she is not. And at that point, a conversation one way or the other is going to ensue.
Marshall or Harry, anything to add to that?
I think that's it. You have to ask them, just how do I ask the professor, how do I have these uncomfortable conversations in my classroom? Have him display it for you.
I will share in a recent college class that I was in, a student went to the professor, and I didn't find this out until later on in the year, but a student had gone to the professor ahead of time. She had found 2 books in the library that were freely available to everyone. I think they were both available electronically. And she went to the professor and said, I'd really like to see these books added to your syllabus as recommended reading when we talk about a particular topic. And they were books that had a kind of a different perspective that she was interested in. And so that could be something as well. Teachers often, they follow their course syllabus, and it's got a long list of recommended books, and they often stick with the same things. But most professors I know are kind of open to getting that type of feedback from students about a new perspective or way they want to go with the class. So I would hope you could do a little research ahead of time yourself, do some of the work for a professor or a colleague, and show them these are resources available. Can we include these? Not even asking them to get rid of anything that they plan to do, but can you include these resources as potential readings when we talk about power or race or whatever it might be.
We've had a couple of really good, really meaty questions come in that I'm not certain we can delve into in the amount of time that we have left tonight. So I did want to promise everybody that this isn't the end of the conversation; it's the start of the conversation. We already discussed in our planning sessions. Okay, so if they want more, what can we do? So I think that this has been a really good conversation to have. And I think that it's one of what will hopefully be many conversations that we can have with the panelists we've had tonight and additional ones as well. So
Dave, can I jump in for one final thing? I apologize. You did a great job wrapping up, and I'm going to take us backwards for 1 second. But Troy had asked a question in the chat that caught my eye. It's kind of specifically talking about teaching social studies and but bringing in kind of an anti-racist perspective. And I was thinking about kind of how teachers might get backlash from parents or others when you try to do this. And it reminded me of something I read recently about this topic, and the recommendation was for teachers that you don't have to put a picture of a politician on your board and tell everybody what this man or woman said is racist and then defend it. What we need to do is teach our students how to recognize language that's racist, and then they'll figure that out on their own when we share what that politician may have said. And so really that core is giving them, and Harry, Marshall, and Anthony have talked about this, teaching those skills about identifying this themselves in the media and elsewhere, and then giving them exposure to, multiple perspectives and letting them figure that out on their own and hope that they do.
You are absolutely right on that. And like I said, I am going to wrap us up now. But I like I said, this is not the end of this conversation. These are the books that I threw in the chat that Marshall had sent to me while we were, while we were answering some of the other questions. I did want to let you guys know, though, that this conversation is important, as you're aware. And the online learning community really, really wants to thank Sean for moderating this conversation tonight, and Marshall, Anthony, and Harry for providing such great insight into the topic. It's important, and while we were going through this, I texted my gen ed director at my ISD, and I said, this is a webinar everyone needs to see, regardless of what content area they teach in. So in that spirit, I'm letting you guys know that I'm going to edit this tonight and get it up so that you can bring it back to your colleagues very, very soon. And there will be 2 ways to access this. And you'll be able to access the recording starting tomorrow. You can visit the MCSS website and click on webinars, and there will be a new button here with this title on it that you can click on to access the recap there. And our statewide social studies collaborative website that all the ISDs and content organizations are trying to funnel social studies through at www.misocialstudies.org. So once again, on behalf of everyone at MCSS, I want to thank you for attending tonight and thank our panelists for starting this conversation. We will probably send you a survey for some follow-up in the next week or so and would appreciate your feedback. And to Sean, Marshall, Anthony, and Harry, thank you for giving your time to the teachers in attendance tonight and the thousands that will undoubtedly view the recaps. We're grateful for your time. So thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic weekend.